Okay, so you want to own a gladiator, buy the man, lock him in a school, feed him, and rent his body out to whoever is throwing the games. But here is the strange part. Half the men you would buy were not captured and were not born into chains. They walked in on their own 2 feet and signed themselves away, their freedom, their bodies, their years, for money they already owed to somebody else. You are not buying a warrior, you are buying a man who sold himself, and a contract that pays you whether he stands up at the end or stays down in the sand. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. That's the whole game. Everything else is just the story of how Rome turned a living man into a thing you could buy, rent, mend, and bill. It even made him swear an oath of thanks for it. Because before he was yours, he was somebody. Picture him, a free man, born with a name and a family, who fell into a debt he could never climb back out of. Not a criminal, not a slave, just a man who ran out of road. And in Rome, when a man ran out of everything, there was one last door left, and it led down into the sand. He could sell the only thing he had left, himself. So he walked into the school, and he swore the oath that every new man swore: to be burned, to be chained, to be beaten, to hand his own body over to another man's will. With those few words, a free man became property. He did it for the money, and the money went home to feed the people he loved, in a house he would almost never see again. And the other half of the men you'd own never chose anything at all. They were the ones Rome had beaten in some far-off war, pulled from a burning village in Gaul, or Thrace, or Syria, marched in chains across a continent, and sold off in a market like sacks of grain until they ended up in your school. One season, a farmer with children. The next, a line in another man's ledger. Whatever language he was born speaking, in the arena he answered to a single invented name, the way you'd name an animal you'd paid for. And here is what you actually bought when you bought him. Not his courage, his risk. You owned the man, but the real fortune was in renting him out, and the contract carried a clause that tells you everything you need to know about Rome. If your gladiator fell in the arena, the man who had hired him owed you up to 50 times what he had paid to borrow him. 50 times, so you collected when your man won, and you collected far more when he did not. You were the one person in the entire bloody business who could not lose. There was even a word for what you were. It came from the old Etruscan tongue, and it meant executioner. But you never once lifted a blade. You just owned the men who did and counted the money that came back either way. Now here is the part nobody tells you, the part that turns your stomach once you understand it. You've always pictured the arena as a place where men simply went to fall. It wasn't. A trained gladiator took years and a small fortune to build, and a fallen one cost you everything. So the very last thing anyone wanted was for him to fall. In one town's surviving records of dozens of fights, only a handful ended badly. They kept him alive on purpose. They fed him barley and beans until a soft layer of fat sat over his muscle, so that when the crowd wanted a spectacle, the marks stayed shallow and he could rise and fight again next month. They gave him the finest physician in the empire. The greatest doctor in all of Roman history learned his craft mending these men. His bones knit cleaner and grew stronger than a free citizen's ever would. And none of it, not the food, not the medicine, not the warm baths, was kindness. It was maintenance. They didn't keep the man alive. They kept their money alive, and the man simply happened to be wrapped around it. And here is the part that aches, because it wasn't all chains and cold arithmetic. Some of these men became gods. A great fighter could walk out of that arena into a roar that shook the stone. His name screamed by tens of thousands of strangers, scratched into the walls of the city by women who had never once met him. A debtor, a foreigner, a man who owned nothing and answered to an invented name, and for one golden afternoon, the most beloved figure in all of Rome. He tasted something most free men would live and end without ever knowing, and that was the trap hidden inside the dream, because the cheers were real, and the love was real, and every last bit of it belonged to the man who owned him. Even the glory was just one more line on the ledger, but that same crowd that adored him also held his fate in their hands, and they decided it with the gesture. When a man could fight no longer, he could sink to his knees and raise a single finger and beg. And then the stands chose. Tens of thousands of strangers who would never know his name turned their hands one way or the other, and in that instant, a man who had given them their whole afternoon learned whether he would see the morning. His entire life balanced on the mood of a crowd that had already forgotten him by supper. And the cruelest part is that he wasn't even the thing being sold. You were watching a man strain and suffer for an afternoon, but the men in the good seats were buying something else entirely. They were buying you. A politician who wanted power worked out that he could purchase a whole city's love with a single afternoon of other men's pain. They even had a phrase for it: bread and circuses. Feed the people enough and amaze them enough, and they will hand you anything. Their votes, their voices, their republic. Julius Caesar once put 320 pairs of these men on the sand at once, more than anyone in history had dared, and buried himself so deep in debt to do it that it should have finished him. It bought him a city instead, and the whole mad machine reached its peak when an emperor decided he wanted to be the very thing slaves were forced to be. Commodus walked down into the arena himself 735 times, every match arranged, every opponent folding before him, and billed the treasury 1,000,000 coins for each appearance, while a soldier guarding the edge of the empire earned barely 1,000 in a year. His own father had written a law to stop these games from ruining Rome. The sun nearly emptied Rome's vaults playing in them. But the night before a man fought, there was one last ritual, and it was a strange and quiet kind of cruelty. The fighters were given a great public feast, and the crowd was let in to watch them eat it. Strangers walked the tables, looking the men over, picking their favorites for tomorrow, while the fighters sat there knowing that some of them were eating their last good meal in front of an audience. Picture that. Your final evening on Earth, and the city files in to watch you chew. And yet inside that school, chained alongside men dragged in from every corner of a conquered world, something happened that the men who owned them never planned for and could never put on the books. They became a family, the only one most of them had left. They built their own quiet brotherhoods, pooling what little they were given, so that when one of them fell, there would be a proper farewell, and a few coins sent home to a widow in some province he would never see again. On paper, the man you owned belonged to you, but in the dark of the barracks, he belonged to the men beside him, and they were the only ones who would ever truly mourn him. And ask any of them what he was holding on for, and it was never the crowd and never the coins. It was a piece of wood. After enough years of surviving, a gladiator could be handed a plain wooden sword, the rudis, and with it, his freedom. That sword was the whole dream he carried into every fight, the picture he held in the dark of the barracks. Some men earned it, most never did, and there is the final cruelty of owning a man. You were paid all along the way, no matter which one he turned out to be, the one who walked out free or the one who never walked out at all. So what did you really own when you owned a gladiator? Not a warrior, not a hero. You owned a man's last few years, bought up front while he still breathed. You owned his hunger and his hope, and the wooden sword he prayed for in the dark. And when it was finally over, most of these men left behind nothing at all. No tomb, no name anyone kept. One of them, a fighter they called Flamma, got a single stone in Sicily, carved not by a wife or a son, because the arena had left him neither, but by another gladiator, a brother from the same sand. That was the whole inheritance of a man you could buy and sell, a few worn lines on a rock, written by the only family he had left. A gladiator was never a warrior. He was a man, sold by the pound, kept breathing for the money, and remembered by no one but the next man waiting his turn. And every coin he ever won went home to someone he would never hold again.